Hi, I'm Teena Wagner, and I wanted to share my testimony today with the world. I want everybody to know about Jesus, and I want you to know what He's done for me in my life. And I'm just going to start from the beginning. When I was about 5 years old, I started going to church. My mom got saved, and my mom and dad started at a little church called Community. We went to church there, and I was 7 when a friend of my mom's asked me to go to VBS. And I went with her that night to Mount Carmel Church, and her name was Sue Ann Cook, and that's real important in my story. I got saved at age 7 at VBS. She led me to the Lord. She brought me home, and my mom took me to my room, and we had a good talk about what it meant to be saved and what was going on in my life. And you know, at that age, there wasn't a whole lot for me to change, but I still needed salvation. And went to church at Community till I was about 17 years old. I met this wonderful man, Terry Wagner, and we started dating. We dated about 6 months, and we got married. We got married at a little church called Liberty, and Liberty is where we started going to church. He had already went there. And then after a couple years, we were called away from there, and we started attending a church called Calvary Temple at Fredericktown. And we went there. I think I was 21 when we started going there. Our children were born there, and, well, Terry was already born. Tyler was, he had just been born, and Teena was born during the time we were at Calvary. And at age 50, now why God waited so long, I don't know, but we spent several years. We spent 29 years at Calvary Church, and I felt like God was calling us away from there for some reason. I just didn't feel like things were going the way they should. It may have just been my life. I don't know. But I do know that God has a way of doing things, and He has a way of moving us when we won't move ourselves. And so I just felt like there was something not right, maybe in my life, or whatever the problem was. It just wasn't right with me and my soul. And my husband kind of felt the same way, and we left Calvary Church, and it was in February of 2019. And I started attending. We didn't know where we were going to go or what we were going to do. We had attended church our whole life together. And my son went to Patton Outreach, and so I started going to Patton and attending church with him and his wife and my 2 grandchildren. And there pastors started preaching, and different preachers came in, and it seemed like they all had the same message. And it was all the things that was on my heart, all the things that I felt like was that I was lacking, or something wasn't right. I just felt like those were problem areas that I had been dealing with already. Maybe not in my life, but just things that was going on. And they all matched up to every preacher that came and preached. And I knew then that I was in the right place and God was dealing with me. And in February, around April, is when I started feeling the call to preach. And I fought the thoughts. My mom was a preacher when I was a kid. And you can read the whole testimony on this website, but I wanted to share it personally. I just kept fighting the thoughts. I would push them aside. I would say, God, you're not telling me that. That's just going in my mind. There were so many things going through my mind, and I thought, I've got to get away from this. God, you've got to deal with me in another way. I tried to do other ministries. I was teaching a class. There was a lot of things I was trying to fulfill that emptiness or that spot where God was calling me to preach, because I didn't want to do that. But see, when God calls you, you have to do what He tells you to do, not what you want to do. And I went on this trip. We went to Branson, I believe it was, and I was reading my Bible. That was one thing I really lacked all these years, was studying the Word and spending a lot of time in the Word. I taught Sunday school. I had done everything. I'd studied and I had read, but just feeding my soul with the Word, I lacked that. And I talked about it a lot during all those years. But I found myself reading the Bible all the time. And as I was reading, I would fight the thoughts because they would be there. But on this trip, I thought, I opened the Bible and there was Jonah, and I started reading. I was like, oh, I love this story, you know? So I started reading it, and it wasn't but just into a few scripture there that I realized again, it was God telling me that I was running from the call. And I fought the thoughts. I tried to get rid of them. And then May 25th, we went to Mexico. And first, our trip started out, we got to St. Louis, and we was getting ready to get on the plane, and there was a bunch of our family members that was going for the first time with me and my husband. And I believe there was around 13 of us going. And I had logged in everybody's names for our flights. And when we got there, there was a discrepancy in one of the names. And so I thought my brother-in-law and sister-in-law wasn't going to get on the plane. They had, nobody would take care of it at the desk, and they told them they had to get online or whatever, and they had to go through all these steps. So they did, and it was right up until time for the gate to close that they were working on this, and they got on the plane with us. We made our couple flights, and we got there. We got in a van and went to the resort. And when we got out at the resort, I noticed that my little black bag was missing. It had everything in it that I need. I never take it off, but somewhere I took it off. I did not have it. It had my passport. It had my money. It had my credit card. Everything in it that I would need. I had to check in for the resort. We couldn't check in without it. At this time, I was in a panic. And everybody, all the family members that were with us were saying, you know, what are we going to do? We talked to the van driver and was going to have him take us back to the airport. And he said, no, only she can go. And he pointed at me. And I thought, well, I'm not going to, you know, get in here and go with this man that I don't know. But it sounded like that was the only option. Well, it had to be a God thing, because I got in that van with the man that I didn't know. He didn't speak any English hardly, just very few words. I didn't speak any Spanish. And I started praying. And I realized on the way there, for about 30 miles, I kept thinking, I don't have a passport. I don't have money. I could get out here and I don't have anything. My husband's back at the resort with my family. What am I going to do, Lord? All I can do is depend on you. I cried all the way to the airport saying, God, please, please let my little black bag be there and all my stuff. And I made a lot of promises to God on that trip. And I got to the airport, and I went up to, the man took me up to the front, and all the people were gone for the day because that was the last flight coming in at that counter. And I thought, what am I going to do? And he said, let me get someone. So he got someone and explained to them in Spanish what was going on. That person interpreted. And they went and got another man from the airline. He came out and he said, well, he said, everybody's went home for the day. I don't think there's anything we can do. He went to the back and he come back and he said, well, there was something left on the plane, but they thought it was a book. And it's been locked in the vault, so I don't know that we can even get keys. Well, the whole time he was gone, it seemed like forever. I don't know, probably 10 minutes or 15. It was a long time. I did a lot more praying and a lot more promising God. God, if you just, you take care of this problem, you fix it, and I will do just what you tell me to do. I will answer the call to preach. And a little while later, he come back. And he said, you know, I found someone with the keys. They left again, and then they come back, and he had my little black bag. I just broke down and cried. And I told God, I said, okay, Lord, I promise you that's what I will do. I'll do just what you're telling me to do. I left the airport, thanked the man several times. He did wait on me. I was afraid he would leave because I didn't know how to really tell him, except for I just begged him, please don't leave me. I came outside and he was there. He took me back to the resort, and I met up with my family, and I had my passport. I had all the reservations. We got checked in, and as time went on through that vacation, that whole week, I knew that God was telling me this, but I kept trying to push it out of my mind. And I kept saying, making excuses. God, but you know I can't do it. You know that I can't do it. And he kept telling me, but you promised me. So our trip went on. I was trying to push it out of my mind. We had a good vacation. And we started to go home. And the thoughts started creeping up on me again. And I kept trying to push it away. Things started going wrong again. We got out to the resort down to wait on the bus to pick us up, and my husband lost his phone. I thought, man, what's going to happen next? And later they found it. They did find his phone, and we got to take it home with us. But then we got to the airport, got dropped off from the shuttle van, and we started in the airport, and my son looks down and he says, oh my goodness, where's his son's bag? And we were like, oh no. He said he must have left it on the shuttle because he had it. So he chased the shuttle across the airport parking lot. I thought, oh, he's going to get killed over these toys in this bag. And anyway, he made it back, and we made it home. And by then it was the first week of June. And my grandson was playing t-ball. And my daughter-in-law and my son was coaching, and she asked me to take some pictures. Well, we went out to the ball field, and the kids were playing, and one was batting, and I was going to get this great picture, of him batting the ball. I went up, and he swung the bat, and it hit me in the ankle. I had this big old knot swelled up on my ankle, probably like the size of an egg. And my whole foot and leg started swelling, and I waited a day or two, and then I thought it's broke. I went to get x-rays. They couldn't tell me whether it was broke or not because of all the swelling, but they said you're just going to have to treat it like it is. I was on crutches. I wore an ACE bandage around it tight to keep the swelling down. I couldn't really put weight on it. And I knew we had this trip coming up in July, and I was hobbling around on crutches, going to church and going to work, and I thought, God, you're going to have to heal this. All the time I'm pushing away what he wants me to do. And I said, we're taking the kids to Florida, and I can't get across the sand. I can't get to the beach on these crutches. You're just going to have to take care of it, God. I'm going to trust you. But I knew why all the things were going wrong in my life, because I wasn't doing what God had called me to do. We got there to Florida. My foot was doing a little better. My son Tyler got sick on that trip. He spent a day or two in the hotel room instead of being with the family. And then my daughter-in-law got sick then after he got better. And there was just one thing after another. And I knew in my heart the reason all these things were happening was because I wasn't in the will of God, that I was not doing what I promised God that I would do. Well, God has a way of, he's going to hang in there, and he's going to keep speaking to you. I just knew that things was not going to be right until I answered the call. Well, I received a call from my daughter. She doesn't miss a trip, and she had to miss our Mexico trip and our July trip. She was pregnant, and they wouldn't let her fly, and they really didn't want her traveling all the way to Florida. And she had lost one baby. She had started spotting about a year before, and she lost a baby. She called me while we were on this trip in July at Florida, and she said, Mom, I started spotting. I knew God has a way. He has a way of getting to you. And I thought, you know what? It's one thing that I'm getting hurt and the things are going on in my life. But for him to start taking things into his hands with my children, he knew that would get me. And I come home and I prayed and I prayed and I said, God, please don't let her lose this baby, because I'm not following your plan because I'm out of your will. And I came home, and there was sermon after sermon, messages directed to me about your calling. There was visiting pastors that would preach, and they would talk about their calling. And they would say, you know, if you're being called, you need to answer the call. Well, I knew all these messages was for me. I was miserable. I was scared to death. Fear had filled me every day. I would cry. I would get in my car and I would pray, please, God, don't let anything happen to me. Don't let anything happen to my children or my grandbabies. And I transported one of my grandbabies, two of them most of the time, but one, I transported her all the time back and forth to daycare. And I'd pick her up in the mornings, or they would drop her off and I'd take her. And I would pray, God, please don't let me pull out in front of a semi. Don't let me have a wreck. Don't harm my grandbabies. And I kept waiting on that call from my daughter that she had lost her baby. I just knew that God was telling me that. And, you know, our testimonies are really important. I kept remembering Brother Carl from church. And I kept remembering his testimony many times that he gave about a dream or a vision that he saw of his son floating by on a cloud. And he said that God had told him that he was going to take that son if he didn't answer the call. And see, God allowed me to remember that testimony for a reason. And I kept praying and praying and asking God to make it go away, and he didn't. And so I put a fleece out. You would think by now I would know that I didn't need a fleece, but I put a fleece out and I said, God, I've heard different ones say that when they're called to preach, that someone came to them, or some pastor or a friend came to them and said, hey, you've been called to preach, and gave them that confirmation. Well, so my fleece was, God, if you want me to preach, then you send somebody in the church or a preacher to tell me specifically that I've been called to preach. Got to church that morning, and the pastor said, I got a call this morning, and Jess Mills called, and he said that he needed to preach, that he had a message. Well, this is an 80-year-old man that can barely walk. He got up and he started preaching as hard as he could. And I mean, he was giving it all. He was holding on to the pews to preach. He could hardly see. He's almost blind in one eye. He can't see well out of the other. And what do you think he said? He started preaching, and he was preaching on God calling you. And he literally said, if God is calling you to do something, you will know it, and you don't need no man to tell you. I about fell out of the pew. I believe it was the next Sunday the pastor preached on his call to preach. And then Wednesday night, a young preacher, Robert, just started preaching. He said, you may not have a tomorrow, as he was given the altar call. And he said, what are you waiting on? He said, tomorrow is a scary word. He thought that he was preaching to the lost, and he may have been, but he was also preaching to me, because the word says, he that hath an ear, let him hear. And I knew that God was telling me, and he'd been talking to me for a long time. I had clenched the seat as long as I could. I went to the altar, and privately between me and God, on July 24th of 2019, I answered the call, promising God that I needed to go home and share it with my husband first, and then I would share it with the church. I was afraid of what Terry was going to say, but I knew that it was no longer a question. I either did it or there was going to be some more things happen in my life that was not going to be good. And Sunday night came. I went home and I didn't share it with him. That was a Wednesday night. Sunday come and I wanted to go forward. I wanted to announce my call to preach, but I was so afraid. Sunday night come, another preacher came, Philip Jordan. He preached on what you're supposed to be doing for God. And he talked about the calling on your life. Well, I went to the altar crying hysterically. People came around and they didn't know what to think, and they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what. They kept saying, it's going to be all right. Whatever's going on, it'll be okay. I got up and I could hardly stand on my feet. I was shaking and trembling all over, and I said, I've been called to preach. I've never been the same since. I felt like I was walking on air. But I still had to go home and tell my husband because I still didn't tell Terry. And I went home and told him. And you know, my life hasn't been the same since. I feel like I draw closer and closer to God. And that's what He can do for you if you're in His will. And about a year or two later, the pastor was gone, and it was just a few months ago. He was gone, and he asked my son, he asked me to bring the message that Sunday while he was gone. And my son got up and was leading the service. And he said, we pray and we've continued to pray for these people to be saved. We were talking about individuals that we would have been praying for. And he said, you never know what God can do, and you never know what can happen when God's in it. He said, if anyone would have told me 5 years ago I would be leading the service and be the Sunday school superintendent of a church, and my mom would be bringing the message later today, he said, we both would have said you were crazy. But you know, that's what God can do, and that's what God can do in people's lives. And I have one more thing to add to this, my testimony, and this is not on the website. But I got a message from a friend. I hadn't seen her in a long time. We grew up playing together and spending time together at her house and my house, and her brother and I also. And he's a preacher now. And I received this message from her that said, we're celebrating my mom's 50th anniversary. And she said, I just know that she would love it if you could come. Well, I went to my calendar to add that in. And the name that I wrote in, I pulled up my calendar, and I typed in Donnie and Sue Ann Cook. Remember that one that led me to the Lord? It was her 50th anniversary. And as I was adding it in my calendar, I looked down, and already there, on the same date, July 24th, was a message that said, Teena answered the call to preach. See, that's not a coincidence. That's God. They were having their 50th anniversary, and I was called to preach at 50 years old by the same lady that led me to the Lord, and I was going to get to attend their 50th anniversary. And boy, I couldn't wait to get there to tell her I answered the call to preach, and we're sharing the same date. You know, God is a mysterious God, and He works all these things out. And it's amazing what He can do. It's amazing how He pieces together all the puzzle. He puts it all together for us. And that couldn't have just happened. That was a God thing. And I want to thank Sue Ann Cook for leading me to the Lord. You know, I may have got saved anyway, but she led me to the Lord. And she took me to BBS. And I just want to thank her for that, because if she wouldn't have done that, I may not be sitting here today. I may not be giving you this testimony. But God is good. He is not a coincidental God. He puts our life together. as long as we stay in His will. And that's what my goal is, to always stay in His will, always be found serving Him and doing the best I can for Him. And I hope you enjoyed my testimony. Thank you.